can start. So I'm happy everybody made it. I'm sorry for those who didn't get to make it because this is really a special opportunity. I'm really excited. My friend Eliav Grossman over here is going to be giving share for us tonight. He's really amazing. A lot of what I've learned about Tanakh, I really learned with Eliav, both back in camp. We learned together in camp. Back when we were teenagers. We learned Tanakh together in yeshiva. I actually just recently referenced in Shul something about Zechariah that Eliav and I learned together. And now Eliav is finishing his PhD after getting a couple of masters in Cambridge, no big deal. So now Eliav is finishing up his PhD, doing religious studies, and he's going to share a little bit about Yosef and how the Yosef story was received throughout history, etc. So I'm really excited for all of us to get to learn from Eliav. So Eliav, take it away.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Leead. Leead and I do go way back. And first I want to say how grateful I am for this invitation to learn a little bit of Parsha with you all. And I also want to express my envy of you all that you have a rabbi as exciting and dynamic as Leead. So I hope that you appreciate how blessed you are. I thought that tonight it might be interesting to think about Yosef from a perspective that I think maybe doesn't get considered so often. And Leead told me, or Rabbi Staller, I don't know how we're doing titles here, but
Leead to you, it's okay.
Okay. I was informed that there was a series on the character of Yosef, and that in this Parsha series, you all explored the character of Yosef with reference to other characters in Tanakh who also find themselves in the royal courts of foreign leaders, from Esther to Daniel, and thinking about Yosef as this kind of formative type figure for the Israelite who finds himself in a court and how they negotiate those relationships. And that's very interesting. And this is not going to be totally unrelated to those kinds of analyses. But I want to go for a kind of inter-biblical comparative perspective to, I think, a text that often gets short shrift when it comes to studying Tanakh and studying the Parsha especially, and that is the book of Mishlei, or Proverbs. And I will now start sharing my screen. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
terrific. So by this point in the cycle of Beresheit, we're well into the Yosef story. So we know some of Yosef's chief characteristics. We know, of course, that in Parshat Miketz, which we read last week, Yosef successfully interprets the dreams of Paro, and this is, of course, coming on the heels of his successful interpretation of the dreams of the Sar HaMashkim and the Sar HaOfim. But in the beginning of Parshat Miketz, after Yosef successfully interprets Paro's dream, he gets described with two adjectives that are actually pretty rare in Sefer Beresheit and in the Chumash as a whole. So after Yosef tells Paro what his dreams mean, Paro is very impressed, and Yosef continues to advise Paro what actions he should take subsequent to the meaning of these dreams, which herald 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So Yosef says to Paro, "Ve'ata yireh Pharaoh ish navon v'chacham v'shitehu al eretz Mitzrayim," as part of Yosef's grand plan of how to maximize the produce of the 7 years of plenty and how to therefore avoid the kind of pitfalls of the 7 years of famine. He says Paro should find a man of discernment and wisdom, ish navon v'chacham, and he should be set over the entire land. And of course, we all know that Paro says to Yosef immediately after this, Paro says, "Acharei hodia Elohim otcha et kol zot, ein navon v'chacham kamocha." There is no one who is wise and understanding like you. I want to focus on these two adjectives, navon v'chacham. So it's actually interesting to consider that none of the three patriarchs, neither Abraham, Yitzchak, or Yaakov, are called wise or understanding. They're called other things. They're called trustworthy for Abraham. They have other characteristics, but they're not called wise or understanding. And to me and to other to Bible scholars, these words recall another genre of biblical literature, what's called by some Bible scholars wisdom literature. And one of the main representatives of wisdom literature is the book of Proverbs, or Mishlei. And of course, Mishlei contains, traditionally attributed to King Solomon, it contains wisdom teachings, how to navigate the world such that you can live a good life. And these wisdom teachings cover lots of different areas of life: how to properly treat one's parents, how to conduct business successfully. Significantly, they often talk about how to rule successfully, how to govern, how to navigate life in a royal court. Some Bible scholars see in wisdom literature the remnants of an international tradition of wisdom, meaning something that wasn't just about kind of the covenant between God and Israel. It was somehow more engaged with the broader ancient Mesopotamian culture. And there are a lot of interesting parallels between teachings that are found in Mishlei and ancient wisdom teachings of Mesopotamia and of Egypt. So just to kind of illustrate this point, I took the very first psukim of the very first chapter of Mishlei, and I just want to look at how many times these two roots, navon and chacham, appear. So in the second verse of Mishlei, chapter 1, ladat chokhma umusar lahavin imrei vina. The goal of this book is to know wisdom and discipline for understanding words of discernment. And then again, in verse 5, Yishma chacham v'yosef lakach v'navon tachpodot yikneh. Let one who is wise hear and let him add to his understanding, and let one who is understanding gain adroitness, I guess, would be the translation according to this one that I've plucked from Sepharia. Anyway, the point is that, of course, these two terms are quite common and in fact are repeated quite often, even in this first chapter of Mishlei. I should also add that if anyone has questions or comments or rude interjections, please, I welcome them at any point. So
Eliav can handle it, so don't go easy.
That's right, yeah. So, okay. I think what the point of that was, I wanted to establish that these descriptors that are used to describe Yosef are somewhat anomalous in the book of Beresheit, and they recall rather strikingly the genre of wisdom literature, which in this case I want to focus on in Mishlei. So staying in the first chapter of Mishlei, I think it will be quite interesting to see that some of Yosef's adventures and episodes of his life are mirrored in some ways by the instructions that this wise teacher in Mishlei, again traditionally thought to be King Solomon, that these teachings that are given to the student. So in verse 10 of the first chapter, and I'm here on the bottom of this first page, the teacher is addressing his student, and the student is always addressed as a son. So the teacher says, "B'ni im yifatucha chata'im al toveh." My son, if sinners entice you, do not yield to the temptation. Im yomru l'cha itanu. If people say to you, come with us, l'cha itanu. Ne'erva ladam nitzpena l'naki chinam. Let us lie in ambush to draw blood. Let's kill someone or rob them in ambush. Nitzpena l'naki chinam. Let's wait for someone who is innocent so we can rob them. Nivlaim kish'ol chayim. Let us swallow them up as if they go down to the underworld alive. Utzmimim ki or devor. And let us swallow up pure ones as if they are ones who are, and make them essentially, let us cut their lives short, let them go down to the pit. So these terms, being swallowed up, going down to a pit, being innocent, and yet people taking advantage of someone's innocence for their own gain, to me recall the story of Yosef being thrown into a pit, and being taken advantage of by his brothers for monetary gain. So I think that already in the first chapter of Mishlei, we have not only these two adjectives, navon v'chacham, that again unusually are used to describe Yosef. We also have a certain episode, a wisdom teaching, which is in some way paralleled, although again it's not in the context of a wisdom teaching in Beresheit, but in some way it's Yosef's brothers are kind of the anti-wisdom, and Yosef is the one who is the victim of this anti-wisdom. One of the major themes in Mishlei is an insistence that foreign women are dangerous. And over again, you'll see if you scan through Mishlei, the student is advised to keep, and it's important, I think, also to note the gender. It's always a male student. The student is advised to stay away from dangerous foreign women. The first time this happens is in the second chapter of Mishlei. So I'm reading here. And the teaching is that if you follow the teachings of wisdom, then those teachings of wisdom will save you from a foreign woman, from a Isha Zara and a Nochriya, whose talk is smooth. So this foreign woman is considered to be dangerous. Her house sinks down to death. And again, in the 5th chapter of Mishlei, Kinofet titofna siftei zara v'chalak mishemen chika v'acharita mara chalana chada kecherev piyot ragleha yordot mavet she'or tzeadeha yitmochu. And then again, in the last verse here that I'm highlighting right now, harchek me'aleh darkecha v'al tikra v'el petach beita. So we don't need to go into the particular details of what each word means, but it's clear that for whatever reason, and historically there could be a lot of reasons why this is the case, but for my purposes, it's not so important why it's the case. Simply to note that one of the main teachings in this wisdom tradition is that it's important to stay away from foreign women. And it's again interesting that in the life story of Joseph, one of his formative episodes is this temptation of the wife of Potiphar, who of course is a non-Canaanite, non-Israelite, not from the extended family of Jacob. And Joseph has this ordeal where he has to resist her temptations, her attempted seductions. And to me, I think, and again, I'm drawing this from other scholarship as well, this is in many ways a direct instantiation of this wisdom trope, where in Mishlei, you're kind of hit over the head with this idea of staying away from foreign women. And there you go, Joseph in real life, he encounters this foreign woman who tries to get him to stray, and he resists. So that's just point number 2, to think about Joseph as a sort of instantiation or exemplification of a wisdom tradition. Here we have, again, in the 6th chapter of Mishlei, another teaching that emphasizes the need to distance oneself from a foreign woman. And I would this is kind of a sidebar, but just to highlight one pasuk, Ki ba'ad isha zona ad kikar lachem ve'eshet ish nafesh yikarat tatsut, which here is translated as the last loaf of bread will go for a harlot, a married man will snare a person of honor. So whether it's actually saying that a person will use their kind of barter their last loaf of bread to spend some time with an isha zona, I'm not sure, but there is clearly a connection between kikar lachem and this foreign woman. And it's just interesting to note that when Yosef is kind of considering, is it right for me to give in to this temptation of Eshet Potiphar or not? He says that Potiphar has given me everything. He has given me control over everything except for ki'im halachem asher hu ochel, which some have seen as a metaphor for his wife. And again, here it's interesting to note that here the two things are clearly connected. And then just one other small point in this next verse here, can a person light a fire on his chest and his clothes not be burned? So again, of course, what happens in the story of Eshet Potiphar, Yosef's clothes become detached from him. So there's some imagery here that I think gets carried over from Mishlei to Beresheit.
Eliav?
Yeah.
It's striking. All this stuff is awesome. I've never heard of this or seen this before. But it's very striking to me how much of this stuff, which is clearly referencing Yosef, is also equally applicable to other royal figures, which to me doesn't make this less convincing, but honestly makes it seem more like, in a way I never appreciated before, Yosef is like a royal archetype. And like David and Shlomo, even with their problems with women or the betrayals they experience, et cetera, are all these like prophetic realizations of like the biblical archetype of royalty, which is always going to corrupt due to women, always going to corrupt due to betrayal and petty politics, et cetera, et cetera. But like we have this first in Yosef, our first like Jewish hero, to make the royal stage.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think that's a really fruitful idea. So you're suggesting to think of, for example, Shlomo's corruption by marrying, and I would also note that who is it that uh, kind of the foreign marriage that inaugurates Shlomo's downfall, so to speak. It's the daughter of Paro,
Paro,
right?
exactly, yeah, for sure. And then also the Ish and Ish stuff could also just as equally apply to Bathsheba and David,
Exactly.
or that's also like a huge factor in the story there, etc. Yeah, this is really cool stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it would be very interesting to try and chart further those kinds of threads that run from the story of Yosef as a kind of royal figure to through to David and Shlomo, and also it would be worth thinking about whether, right, Yosef, of course, in Nevi'im, the children of Yosef, Ephraim, and Manasseh come to be a sort of shorthand for the northern kingdom. But you have most of the stories that you're talking about, David and Shlomo, are in the Judean kingdom, kind of where the main action is in in the biblical prophets. So it's interesting to think about the extent to which there might be kind of implicit critiques by assigning certain missteps and mistakes to Judean kings versus northern kings, and whether Yosef is a type for the Judean king or the northern king more. I think all that stuff is also very interesting. So another example that I want to point to quickly about wisdom teachings that I think are expressed in the Yosef story appears again early on in Mishlei in the 6th chapter. And here the wisdom teacher is gesturing towards the animal kingdom for a metaphor about how to be industrious, how to work hard. And he says as follows, Lech el nimala atzel re'ei deracheha v'chacham. Or maybe v'chachem, I can't read it. So the translation here, lazy bones, that's a great great translation. It's not in the text, but it says, go to an ant, study its ways, and become wise from it. Asher ein la katzin shoter umoshel. It has no leader, officer, or rulers. Tachin bakayitz lachma, agra bakatzir ma'achala. Prepare in the summer its bread, store it up, and gather the food at the harvest. So this is about preparing food when you have a lot of food for a time when you will have less food. And of course, this is also something that Yosef does to great effect. He teaches, he instructs Paro how to most effectively store the grain and then disperse that grain when there is none in the 7 years following. I would also point out the verbiage in this middle verse here, Asher ein la katzin shoter umoshel. Right, these are words that apply to Yosef. Yosef becomes a katzin shoter umoshel, and he becomes that by virtue of this, that he prepares the food in a time of plenty for when there is less. So I think this is another example of a kind of classic wisdom teaching. And again, this teaching appears not just in this one isolated incident in Mishlei, but in other places as well. It's a wisdom teaching that is kind of exemplified and instantiated and manifested by Yosef. And then just in general, I mentioned before that some scholars have seen in Mishlei and in the biblical wisdom tradition this kind of international tradition that crosses boundaries and isn't confined, excuse me, just to the sort of covenantal tradition, say, of biblical prophets, which focuses more on the relationship between God and Israel in particular. And it's also a tradition that is connected to kingship and to royalty. And so here in the 8th chapter of Mishlei, we have the following: Bi malachim yimlochu, v'roznim yichloku tzedek. Here, this is actually the voice of wisdom. Wisdom, who in Mishlei is imagined as a woman, which is quite interesting. And I think in many ways, this woman wisdom or lady wisdom is imagined in Mishlei as a kind of counter figure to the seductive foreign woman. So the foreign woman is the bad woman to be avoided, and lady wisdom is the woman to be followed, to be pursued. And anyway, so this kind of personified version of wisdom is speaking in the 8th chapter of Mishlei, and she says that kings rule through me, and rulers will righteously decree laws with me. Meaning, wisdom is essential to good rulership. Bi sarim yasuru unedivim kol shoftei tzedek. And again, people of power rule through me. So again, this tradition of governance and of political power is strongly related to wisdom. And I think that that too ties into this figure of Yosef as a political figure who is navon v'chacham, industrious, and avoids foreign women. So with all this, I think it's safe to say that there's a lot of good and interesting evidence for a portrait of Yosef that is being deliberately drawn by the Torah as a incredibly wise and almost the kind of the epitome of wisdom, someone who literally exemplifies the most outstanding wisdom characteristics that are laid out elsewhere in the Tanakh and applies them in real life. But I want to suggest that there's actually a great deal of ambiguity about this image of Yosef as a wisdom figure. And to do that, I want to go all the way back to the beginning of Bereshit, where I think that the picture that we get of wisdom is very different. And in doing this, I think we'll get a different idea about what Yosef's wisdom is about, or at least a different perspective. So, of course, in the famous story of Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden, everything's going swimmingly until the serpent shows up. And there's an interesting adjective that is used to describe the Nachash, the serpent. So at the beginning of the 3rd chapter of Bereshit, we see V'hanachash haya arum mikol chayat hasadeh asher asa Adonai Elohim vayomer el ha'isha af ki amar Elohim lo tochlu mikol eitz hagan. This serpent is described as arum, which in modern Hebrew means naked, but that's not what it means in biblical Hebrew. And you'll recall that in the very first chapter of Mishlei, there was a word that I bolded that we didn't speak about because I was saving it for later. Maybe I didn't bold it. I did bold it. The goal of this book and of wisdom in general is latet lifsaim orma, lenar dat umzima. The goal of wisdom is to give to the foolish orma, shrewdness. Orma really here is just a synonym for wisdom. It's clearly a good thing. It's unambiguously a good thing. This is the goal of wisdom. And for the Nachash, this orma, the Nachash is arum, is self-evidently a bad thing. The Nachash is not wise, he is cunning. And I think the reason why the JPS translation is kind of pushed to translate orma in Mishlei as shrewdness is because it's aware that there is this negative connotation to the word elsewhere. But I think that it's actually a little bit misleading because I think that in Mishlei, there really is no negative connotation. And so I think that that's an interesting translation decision that kind of reflects the sort of surprising valences, different valences of the word in Bereshit and Mishlei. And of course, what does the Nachash push Chava to do? He tells her you should eat from this Eitz Hada'at, this tree of knowledge or of wisdom. And this action of gaining wisdom by eating from the tree is, again, unambiguously figured as a bad thing. It is bad for human beings to gain wisdom for some reason. It's off limits. So scholars have noticed this, and some scholars have suggested that actually the beginning of Bereshit really isn't so hot on wisdom. It's kind of an anti-wisdom text. The idea being, I think, that there are certain parts of human knowledge that ideally wouldn't have been accessible to human beings, would have been left to God. And again, that's kind of a larger discussion of why that's the case and what that means. And that I think would be a fascinating discussion in its own right. But what I want to focus on is what are the consequences of this action, of the action of eating from the Eitz Hadat, of becoming wise and further enlightened. So, of course, the punishments are meted out for woman and then for man. So for Chava, for Isha, El Haisha Amar, and I'm over here, Harba Arbe Itzvonech Veheronech Be'etzev Tel Divanim Be'elishech Teshukatech V'hu Yimshol Bach. One of the punishments for women is that they will have painful childbirth. They'll have pain in labor. For man, Ula Adam Amar, Ki Shamata L'kol Ishtecha V'atocha Min Ha'etz Asher Tziviticha Lemor, Lo Tocha Mimenu, Arura Ha'adama Ba'avurecha B'itzavon Tochalena Kol Yemei Chayecha. You ate from the tree you shouldn't have. What's the punishment? The land is cursed because of you. You will eat from it only with great suffering. And then you will eat bread only by the sweat of your brow. So the punishment for man is that eating, producing food suddenly becomes difficult. And for women, it's that there will be pain in childbirth. So this has me thinking, in Yosef's life story, right? Yosef is born to a mother, Rachel, who has a very painful childbirth with her next son, Binyamin, and she in fact dies from that childbirth. And Yosef is the great overseer of a tremendous famine. So in some way, I think that, right, and again, the operative word used to describe this famine is lechem. That when Yaakov and his sons have no bread, they are told, go down to Egypt and get lechem. And when the people of Egypt who are starved come to Joseph, they say, we have no lechem. We only have our cattle, or we only have ourselves. So I think in some ways, Yosef is not presented only as a kind of perfect instantiation, an exemplification of the wisdom themes that are taught in Mishlei. He is also the anti-wisdom. He is someone who results from a woman who died in childbirth, and he oversees the kind of greatest wanting for lechem in all of Sefer Beresheit. In addition to that, I think it's worth noting that while Yosef does successfully repel Eshet Potiphar, who does he end up marrying? He ends up marrying an Egyptian woman named Osnat, who is, we're explicitly told, the daughter of an Egyptian priest. So for all of his kind of great successes and sort of very direct parallels to the wisdom tradition, he in some ways is also a wisdom failure. One more thing that I wanted to note that I wasn't sure if I put it on the source sheet, but I didn't. Thinking about this emphasis that appears in wisdom literature and Mishlei on distinguishing between who is inside and who's outside, who's within and who is a nochri or a nochriya. The foreign woman, again, is an example of this. One of the interesting things that I thought about today was when Yosef encounters his brothers, what does he do? He pretends not to know them, and the Hebrew word that's used there is actually that he's mitnaker. He pretends to be a nochri. So in some way, Yosef actually upsets or denies these traditional wisdom values. He's both, on the one hand, in some cases, an instantiation of wisdom, and in other cases, a repudiation of wisdom, or the opposite, an anti-wisdom figure in some ways. And I think that this kind of anti-wisdom element in Joseph has to do with certain details in the story that kind of subtly but persistently tell us who's really driving the story, that it's not Yosef's wisdom, it's not his technical skill at manipulating rulers or at knowing exactly what to do. So one example of this is when Yosef is thrown into prison, the pasuk says, "Vayi Adonai et Yosef, vayet elav chesed, vayiten chino be'enei sar beit hasar." The Lord was with Joseph; he extended kindness to him. So it's not Yosef who's using his charm necessarily; it's God. And then again, in later on, after Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim have their dreams and they approach Yosef asking for interpretations, Yosef first says, "Vayomer alehem Yosef, halo le'elohim pitrunim sapru nale." Doesn't God have all of the interpretations? And then finally, again, once Yosef is called before Paro, and is told, "Oh, I've heard that you can interpret dreams very skillfully," Yosef says, "Vayan Yosef et Paro lemor biladai." It's not me, Elohim yanet shalom Paro. It's God who can give Paro his peace of mind. So there is this thread throughout the Yosef story that is somewhat, I think, insistent on God's providence and God's power throughout the story. And I think this maybe coheres with this anti-wisdom thread in the story, that it's insisting that it's really not Yosef's proficiency in wisdom that is giving him all of this great success. So now I want to turn to the afterlife of this story. That is to say, the reception of the Yosef story among a very select group of ancient Jewish authors, ancient Jewish sources. And I think that in these sources, we'll see how these perhaps contradictory perspectives of Yosef as both a wisdom type and an anti-wisdom type receive expression in the Second Temple period. Before I go on, first of all, question, any questions? Any comments?
I think Joel is talking, but it's muted. But as always, feel free to just unmute yourselves and talk. No need to raise a hand.
Oh, okay. Just in English, the word clever can have two very different connotations, depending on the context. Like sometimes when people say, "Oh, he's a very clever lawyer," and they mean it negatively, like shrewd. Right. And then obviously it has a very positive connotation and clever. So there's that duality, just like here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's kind of the point of the story in the beginning of Genesis, of Bereshit, where the point being made in broad strokes is, wisdom isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Sometimes it has its downsides, and there are limitations too. And maybe it makes that point somewhat emphatically.
I think that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say that could potentially also be expressed in the Yaakov story, where there's that intentional pun on Yaakoveni, on like your deceitfulness. That Yaakov is like this like pampered intellectual, but he uses it deceptively. Whereas Esav, who's perhaps the more brutish, anti-intellectual figure, he's the one who's sort of taken advantage of.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting read too.
I also thought it was interesting, going back to the point about the royal nature of the wisdom literature, that if the nature of wisdom literature, the nature of this sort of like royal ethical writing, is such that it's meant to be universalist, or at least aware of other kingships or royalties or other cultures, it's interesting that we would turn to Yosef as our model, given that he's our first and only example of foreign Jewish rulership. Where it's almost like Yosef is not just our model of royalty, but he's our model of how a Jew can be a royal figure, or how they can be a politically savvy figure in a foreign world or in an international stage, which is also sort of interesting for a type of literature that's specifically geared towards an international lens.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think that also kind of heightens the parallel between Yosef and other figures like Daniel and Esther, who are also in foreign courts, and particularly with Daniel, he's also someone, of course, who interprets dreams. But it's, as you said, it's giving you a model not of a kind of Israelite or Judean kingship, but of a kingship in the sort of more established and famous imperial courts of the day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I'd like to turn now to just a couple examples of Second Temple literature that deals with Yosef, and just two sources in the time remaining. We have 25 minutes about? Okay, great. So the first is from a text that's called the Aramaic Levi document. And it's known to us from a couple of places. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, it was known to us from some copies in the Cairo Geniza. But once the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, it became clear just how ancient this text is. So it's probably from the 3rd century BCE, and it tells basically a story about Levi, about Levi, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And it contains a lot of really interesting teachings that Levi gives his children. A lot of them are very technical priestly teachings about how to perform certain services in the temple, how to do sacrifices. But at the very end, there is this very interesting small section that is in praise of wisdom. And scholars have thought that maybe this section is kind of tacked on at the end, because it doesn't really flow naturally with the rest of the sort of priestly teachings of this document. What's interesting is that whereas the rest of this document is extremely focused on the line of Levi, and Levi instructing his children, Kahat, Merari, Gershom, to carry on the line of the priesthood and how to properly perform the service in the temple. Here, there is an explicit reference to Yosef as a kind of figure of wisdom. So I think we can probably skip the Aramaic, because it's a pretty difficult 3rd century BCE Aramaic, and we can refer to it as necessary, but we can look in the English. And I guess I'll just read from the beginning. And in the year 118 of my life, here Levi is talking, in the 118th year of my life, the year in which my brother Joseph died, so he's already mentioning Joseph from the outset, I summoned my sons and their sons, and I began to instruct them all that there was in my heart. I began speaking and said to my sons, listen to the word of Levi your father, and pay attention to the precepts of the beloved of God. I to you, my sons, give orders, and to you I show the truth, my beloved ones. The principle of all your deeds should be the truth, and let justice and truth stay with you forever. You will bring in a blessed harvest. Whoever sows goodness harvests good, and whoever sows evil against him, his seed turns. Okay. But now, reading and instruction and wisdom, teach them to your sons, and wisdom will be with you for eternal honor. He who teaches wisdom will be honored by it, but he who despises wisdom will be given to insult and scorn. See then, my sons, my brother Joseph, who taught reading and instruction of wisdom for honor and for greatness and for kings. Do not neglect wisdom to teach. Every man who teaches wisdom, all his days will be lengthened, and multiplied will be his renown. In each region and province to which he goes, there will be a brother, and he will not be considered a foreigner in it, and will not be like a stranger in it, nor be like a scoundrel in it. Instead, all shall give him glory in it, for all desire to learn his wisdom. His friends are many, and numerous those who wish him well. And they shall seat him upon a throne of glory to listen to the words of his wisdom. So here you have this absolute celebration of wisdom, and it's associated with Levi's brother Joseph. A couple of the features that I want to try and highlight here are here in this 3rd century BCE context, wisdom is associated with reading, which is really scribalism. In the Aramaic, it's safar, someone who is able to write. So that already points to a different context. It's really a Hellenistic context in which wisdom teachings have become scribalized and associated with scribal schools. But that's kind of just a historical data point. And what I would point to here is in each region and province to which he goes, there will be a brother, and he will not be considered a foreigner in it, and will not be like a stranger in it, nor be like a scoundrel in it. Instead, all shall give him glory. So there's this kind of appeal to this, what's really a sort of Greek value of welcoming the visitor, but it's transposed into a biblical key. It's a Greek kind of international value translated into this biblical idiom. And I think what's interesting is that in some ways, this is actually a very honest reading of the biblical story of Yosef, because as we were just speaking about, Yosef is embedded in this Egyptian court. He's somebody who is taken from, as he says, the land of the Hebrews, and he flourishes somewhere where he was not originally raised or born. And Aramaic Levi kind of elevates that element of the Yosef story into a value, into a recognizable goal for somebody to be able to go to another country and be greeted and be celebrated for their wisdom. So clearly here in the Aramaic Levi document, Joseph's wisdom is quite a good thing. It's celebrated. It's a model for Levi's sons, and of course by implication for the reader of this text. And again, it's even kind of interesting to think about the Dead Sea Scroll community. I don't know how much we've studied the Dead Sea Scrolls or are familiar with them, but they're generally thought to come from this extremely sort of insular ascetic community, and not generally people who are thought to have valued a great deal of relationships with people who are not themselves, certainly not people who are outside of their sort of immediate community of their immediate Jewish community on the Dead Sea, the caves by the Dead Sea. So it's quite interesting to think that even here, this image of Joseph as a sort of international figure of renown still had purchase. So clearly it was a deeply powerful image for them, one that really resonated. Does that make sense? And I want to just contrast that, this very laudatory image of Joseph, with a teaching of Philo. So Philo was a Jewish author who lived in Alexandria in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE. And he wrote copiously about a lot of elements of the Tanakh, and he had an allegorical method of reading the Bible, which means that he would read stories in the Bible as representing things from his Platonic philosophy. So when it comes to the story of Joseph, Joseph isn't just a character to be analyzed as a sort of literary figure or a model. He represents certain things. And Philo's most extended discussion of Joseph appears in a book of his called On Dreams. And he's talking about different types of dreams. And for him, the greatest dream is a dream that is from God. The second greatest dream is a dream that is a mixture of kind of direct divine communication and also mixed in with some of the dreamer's own thoughts and feelings. And then the last kind of dream, which is really the lowest and basest kind of dream, is a dream that is motivated by the dreamer's own kind of base aspirations or desires. And he sees in Yosef's dreams kind of the exemplary, outstanding example of the third bad kind of dream. And he says here in his book that he's talking about Yosef, the dreamer himself, referring to Yosef, interpreter of dreams to boot, lays hold of vainglory, deeming it a possession of highest importance and splendor and advantage to human life. So he's saying that Joseph in his allegorical reading is not only a dreamer, but he's somebody who represents this third type of dream, this dream that is driven by what he calls vainglory, by ambition, by kind of empty pride, deeming it a possession of highest importance and splendor and advantage to human life. Meaning Joseph is somebody who has desires, he has aspirations, he wants to get to the top, he wants to, make it in the big city. And for Philo, this is kind of unforgivable. This is sort of the most superficial and reprehensible form of dream. And he goes on, and it's quite striking. Accordingly, it is in the first, I'm just going to read from here. Accordingly, it is in the first instance from dreams, things beloved of night, that he becomes known to the sovereign of the land of the body, not from doings luminous with the self-evidence of manifest fact, things which need day to exhibit them. So Philo here is pointing out that it's significant that Yosef, his fame doesn't come from anything he's actually done. It comes from things that happen at night, from dreams, things of nothingness that he gets recommended to Paro. The next step is that he is proclaimed procurator or protector of all Egypt, to stand second only to the sovereign in the signs of honor shown to him, a position set down as more insignificant and absurd in wisdom's judgment than the infliction of indignity and defeat. So Philo is next making the point that Joseph is kind of the embodiment of something that is unnecessary, that's secondary. And how do we know that he's secondary? Because he's literally made second to Paro. Let's skip down to here, to go back to Joseph. To go back to Joseph, he mounts the second chariot when Joseph is appointed as the viceroy by Paro. He has a chariot, elated by mental dizziness and empty conceit, and becomes the victualler and keeper of the body's treasuries, providing food for it from all quarters, and thus threatens serious danger to the soul. Now Joseph not only represents the bad kind of dreamer, but he represents the body as opposed to the soul. Not the least significant testimony to his principle and ambition for life is his name. Joseph means an adding, and vainglory is always making additions. To what is genuine, it adds what is counterfeit. To what is appropriate, what is alien. To what is true, what is false. To what is sufficient, what is excessive. To vitality, debauchery. To life's maintenance, vanity. So I think this is extremely harsh. I mean, even for Philo, who is engaging explicitly and admittedly in an allegorical reading, where by definition, characters in a story and elements of a story come to represent something bigger than what they are. Still, even for Philo, this is really quite harsh. He's saying that even in Joseph's name, the very meaning of the name Yosef, to add something, it means to be superficial, to be extra. And so he interprets Yosef as exemplifying this vanity, this sort of empty ambition. He exemplifies what is counterfeit as opposed to what is genuine. And from here, Philo departs on this extremely lengthy excursus about all the things that are unnecessary and extra in life. So first he has a section about food. He says, well, humans really only need sort of very basic things in order to subsist, in order to get through life. But why then has vainglory superadded countless sorts of milk cakes and honey pastry, and elaborate and diversified blends of innumerable wines, highly seasoned with a view to indulgence and pleasure rather than partaking of nourishment? So he sees this sort of indulgence as a negative human quality, a sort of human need to supplement that which is necessary and nourishing with that which is spurious and negative for the soul's development. And you see how long the section is just about food. Then he goes into talking about accommodation in a home. Once more, we felt the need of a house to live in for the same reasons, that we may not suffer from the incursions of wild beasts or of men worse than beasts. Why then do we decorate the pavements and walls with costly marbles? He sees this excess of decoration. He sees aesthetics basically as something that is to be avoided, and he sees Yosef as representative of all of this superficiality. Talks about drinking. Again, for drinking, what more was needed than nature's cup, art's very masterpiece, right? What more did you need than just water? Of that cup, hands are the material. We didn't need to have artificially crafted cups. You could just use your hands to drink water. Let a man hold them close together, etc. So he sees any excess as stemming from Joseph. And now here, let's read this part that I've bolded. The day will pass before I have given the sum of the corruptions of human life. And indeed, why need we dwell at length upon them? For who has not heard, who has not seen them? Indeed, who is not conversant and familiar with these excesses and corruptions? And therefore, the holy word, the Torah, did well in giving the name of addition, Yosef, to one who was the enemy of simplicity and the friend of vanity. For just as we find on trees, to the great damage of the genuine growth, superfluities, which the husbandmen purge and cut away to provide for their necessities, so the true and simple life has for its parasite the life of falsity and vanity, for which no husbandman has hitherto been found to excise the mischievous overgrowth, root and all. And so the practicers of sound sense, perceiving that Joseph, first with his senses and afterwards with his understanding, pursues this way of artificiality, cry outright, an evil beast has seized and devoured him. So here Philo is referring back to the story of Yosef thrown into the pit, where when Yaakov sees Yosef's blood, Yosef's coat that has been dipped in goat's blood, he says, Chaya ra'a achalatu, an evil beast has eaten him. And Philo interprets this as referring to Joseph's consumption with superficiality, with vanity, with artificiality, which is kind of a remarkable reading of this verse, especially given that that wasn't actually true. Yosef never was consumed by an animal. So Philo continues here, and indeed this life of confused mankind, so full of complications, of vain inventions, which has covetousness and knavery for its cunning architects, what is it but a ferocious beast, which feasts on all who come near to it? And therefore such as these will be the subject of mourning, as though they were dead, even while they still live, since the life that they obtain is meet to be lamented and bewailed. For Jacob, we are told, mourned for Joseph while still alive. This is extremely harsh, right? He's saying that Yaakov, mourned for Yosef because Yosef was so consumed and addicted to vanity that this mourning was quite appropriate. And then one final, I think, adding insult to injury here. On the other hand, Moses will not suffer Nadav and his brother, those holy principles, to be mourned. They were not seized by a savage evil beast, but were taken up by a rush of fire unquenchable, by an undying splendor. Since in sincerity they cast aside sloth and delay and consecrated their zeal, hot and fiery, flesh-consuming and swiftly moving, to piety a zeal which was alien to creation but akin to God. They did not mount by steps to the altar which the law had forbidden, but wafted by a favoring breeze and carried even to the revolving heavens, were there like the complete and perfect burnt offering, resolved into ethereal rays of light. So Philo, I think the kind of purple prose here can maybe cloud what he's actually talking about. He's talking about Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aharon, who improperly bring a korban and are subsequently killed, consumed by a heavenly fire. And here Philo isn't saying that, oh, how rash and how irresponsible it was of Nadav and Avihu to bring this korban without consulting first with Moshe or with Aaron. He's celebrating them. He's saying they were not seized by a savage evil beast, but were taken up by a rush of fire unquenchable. In sincerity, they cast aside sloth and delay, consecrated their zeal hot and fiery. He's contrasting Nadav and Avihu, who I think on a kind of quick perusal of the Torah are pretty clearly figures who, at least in the eyes of the Torah, are deserving of criticism, and in fact they are killed. So that's a pretty good indication that they did something wrong. And Philo was celebrating them, and he's contrasting them with Joseph. So I think this is. I mean, again, it's easy always to say for Philo, like, okay, he's reading this allegorically. He has a certain philosophical agenda. He's a Platonist. So for him, for Philo, real wisdom is not, doesn't consist in politics, and it doesn't consist in storing up a lot of grain to feed a nation. It really consists in the sort of Platonic meditation on forms and the kind of unification with reason that Middle Platonism espoused. But at the same time, I think that there is something remarkable about this discourse here from Philo, because it's incredibly negative to Joseph. And I don't think we can just sort of hide behind Philo's Platonism or his philosophical agenda to excuse this. So, we have to think. So what is it that Philo is reading in the Joseph story that is giving him such material for this incredibly negative portrayal? And I think one thing is that Philo, it's important to note, was from Alexandria in Egypt. So I think he probably read the story of Joseph as a ruler of Egypt very carefully. And I think he read it right next to the subsequent story, which is the story of how the children of Israel became enslaved to Egypt. And I think he probably read that very sensitively, given the kind of political status of Jews in Alexandria of his day, which was always precarious. And I think that Philo was probably someone who cared a lot about Jews not maybe overstepping their boundaries, not upsetting too many Egyptians or Greek residents of Egypt in his day, and maybe that sort of pushed him to read Joseph more negatively. But I would also suggest that maybe Philo picked up on the sort of ambiguity with respect to Joseph's wisdom that I've been trying to suggest here, in that it's not so clear from the story whether Joseph is just a sort of pure instantiation of wisdom, or whether there are also these sort of negative undercurrents that one can trace throughout the story, where Joseph is not just somebody who successfully rebuffs Aisha Potiphar and somebody who wisely counsels a foreign ruler, but he is someone who was born of a woman who died in childbirth later, and who presided over this great famine, and whose pursuit of wisdom is sometimes just driven by superficial ambition, and who, when confronted with his brothers, pretends to be foreign. Again, these are all qualities that the author of Mishlei would not smile upon. So perhaps Philo was also, just in addition to an allegorizer and a polemicist, he was also somebody who read Genesis very carefully. And so I've just tried to suggest that the two starkly divergent readings of the Yosef story that we have in the Aramaic Levi document on the one hand, and in Philo on the other, are maybe not just products of different historical context or different polemical agendas, but also from different themes that are actually present in Beresheit, in the Yosef story. So thank you for this opportunity, and if there are questions or comments, b'simcha.
That was awesome, Eliav. Thank you so much. Just something I'm thinking about is also how, like, in the Yosef story itself, even on a Pashat level or a biblical level, we see that there is this duality to Yosef's wisdom. That, like, on the one hand, he's the favorite, and he's won Yaakov's love, and that seems to be some sort of position of political power, some status. And we know he does it through bringing the Diba Tamra al Avihem, carrying word or serving some functional role. But then that blows up in his face, and he gets sold because of it. And similarly, perhaps following on a similar path as what you were saying, he becomes this great store man who has this, like, vision and is able to levy taxes to save the Egyptian people. But then he levies taxes that are way too high. The Egyptians hate him and turn on him. And next thing you know, the Jewish people are enslaved. And it's almost like we have this, like, political, worldly, cosmopolitan Yosef who has all this knowledge and intellectualism, is a figure of wisdom, but everything is always going wrong for him. He always goes either too far or something goes wrong. So it's interesting if these two divergent themes or focuses on Yosef as a successful wisdom figure, or like the dangers of perceived wisdom. It's both sort of like inherent in how the story plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great read. The kind of ascent and fall, or at least the sort of plateauing of that ascent, and then where it gets complicated is how you read also the subsequent story. Do you assign the blame for the descent into slavery to Yosef, right? Where the Vayakol melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef, right? So do you read that as an indictment, or do you read that as a sort of coincidence?
Yeah,
that very much rides on how you understand Yosef and his actions, whether they're to be seen as this sort of wise and shrewd, or as kind of calculated and cold.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for this, Eliav. I want to leave the floor open if anyone else has any other questions or comments. But personally, I enjoyed this a lot. This was awesome. So thank you so much for coming and share.